Hello, welcome to day 15 of Mice and Men. So if you looked at your warm-up, there were 3 video options that you could have watched. You could watch one or all 3, doesn't matter. The whole point is that each one of the scenes starts out with a very quiet, light, serene atmosphere, people just kind of like enjoying what they're doing, and then they all go to something very intense very quickly. And so we want to think about why a director, in the case of movies, or an author, in the case of books, would do this. And the idea is just that the intensity is so much more intense when it comes after something very quiet and calm. And the same on the flip side of that. When something very intense happens and then comes the calm moment, it's just like, oh my gosh, what just happened? Like, just kind of a way to give some levity to the situation. And we're going to see kind of that contrast in what we read today. So we are going to be starting on page 89. And we actually have 2 different lessons today. So you'll notice there's a part 1 and a part 2. So part 1, where we're going to start with, is the deliberately changing the pace of the book, and where we shift from something intense to something calm and how that impacts the reader. And then lesson 2 is identifying the climax of the story by noticing how the central character changes drastically, because that's what should be happening in the climax. And this is also should be making a statement about the theme. Again, now we're getting really close to the end of our book. We will finish tomorrow. So we should really be able to figure out some themes right now. So we're going to start with, again, that shift in tone, and then end with that idea of what was the climax of the book, and what shift have we seen. Okay, so we are starting on page 89. We're at the very bottom. Lenny's going on about the rabbits, talking to Curly's wife. He's got the dead dog there. Again, we keep seeing the mistakes Lenny makes escalating, and him not facing any real consequences for any of them. And George does not yet know about this dead dog. All right. She asked, "What makes you so nuts about rabbits?" Lenny had to think carefully before he could come to a conclusion. He moved cautiously close to her until he was right against her. "I like to pet nice things. Once at a fair I seen some of them long-haired rabbits, and they was nice, you bet. Sometimes I've even pet mice, but not when I could get nothing better." Curly's wife moved away from him a little. "I think you're nuts," she said. "No, I ain't," Lenny explained earnestly. "George says I ain't. I like to pet nice things with my fingers, soft things." She was a little bit reassured. "Well, who don't?" she said. "Everybody likes that. I like to feel silk and velvet. Do you like to feel velvet?" Lenny chuckled with pleasure. "You bet, by God," he cried happily. "And I had some, too. A lady gave me some, and that lady was my own Aunt Clara. She gave it right to me, about this big a piece. I wished I had that velvet right now." A frown came over his face. "I lost it," he said. "I ain't seen it for a long time." Curly's wife laughed at him. "You're nuts," she said. "But you're kind of nice fella, just like a big baby. But a person can see kind of what you mean. When I'm doing my hair sometimes, I just sit and stroke it 'cause it's so soft." To show how she did it, she ran her fingers over the top of her head. "Some people get kind of coarse hair," she said complacently. "Take Curly. His hair is just like wire, but mine is soft and fine. Of course, I brush it a lot. That makes it fine. Here, feel right here." She took Lenny's hand and put it on her head. "Feel right around here, there, and see how soft it is." Lenny's big fingers fell to stroking her hair. "Don't you muss it up," she said. Lenny said, "Oh, that's nice." And he stroked harder. "Oh, that's nice. Look out now, you'll muss it." And then she cried angrily, "You stop it now. You'll muss it all up." She jerked her head sideways, and Lenny's finger closed on her hair and hung on. "Let go," she cried. "You let go." Lenny was in a panic. His face was contorted. She screamed then, and Lenny's other hand closed over her mouth and nose. "Please don't," he begged. "Oh, please don't do that. George'll be mad." She struggled violently under his hands. Her feet battered on the hay, and she writhed to be free, and from under Lenny's hand came a muffled screaming. Lenny began to cry with fright. "Oh, please don't do none of that," he begged. "George gonna say I done a bad thing. He ain't gonna let me tend no rabbits." He moved his hand a little, and her hoarse cry came out. Then Lenny grew angry. "Now don't," he said. "I don't want you to yell. You're going to get me in trouble, just like George says you will. Now don't you do that." And she continued to struggle, and her eyes were wild with terror. He shook her then, and he was angry with her. "Don't you go yelling," he said, and he shook her, and her body flopped like a fish. And then she was still, for Lenny had broken her neck. He looked down at her, and carefully he removed his hand from over her mouth, and she lay still. "I don't want to hurt you," he said, "but George'll be mad if you yell." When she didn't answer, nor move, he bent closely over her. He lifted her arm and let it drop. For a moment he seemed bewildered, and then he whispered in fright, "I done a bad thing. I done another bad thing." He pawed up the hay until it partly covered her. From outside the barn came a cry of men and the double clang of shoes on metal. For the first time Lenny became conscious of the outside. He crouched down in the hay and listened. "I done a real bad thing," he said. "I shouldn't have did that. George'll be mad. And he said, and hide in the brush till he come. He's going to be mad. In the brush till he come, that's what he said." Lenny went back and looked at the dead girl. The puppy lay close to her. Lenny picked it up. "I'll throw him away," he said. "It's bad enough like it is." He put the pup under his coat and crept to the barn wall and peered out between the cracks and toward the horseshoe game, and then he crept around the end of the last manger and disappeared. The sun streaks were high on the wall by now, and the light was growing soft in the barn. Curly's wife lay on her back, and she was half covered with hay. It was very quiet in the barn, and the quiet of the afternoon was on the ranch. Even the clang of the pitched shoes, even the voices of the men in the game seemed to grow more quiet. The air in the barn was dusky in advance of the outside day. A pigeon flew in through the open hay door and circled and flew out again. Around the last stall came a shepherd bitch, lean and long, with heavy hanging dugs. Halfway to the packing box where the puppies were, she caught the dead scent of Curly's wife, and the hair rose along her spine. She whimpered and cringed to the packing box and jumped in among the puppies. Curly's wife lay with a half covering of yellow hay, and the meanness and the plannings and the discontent and the ache for attention were all gone from her face. She was very pretty and simple, and her face was sweet and young. Now her rouged cheeks and her reddened lips made her seem alive and sleeping very lightly. The curls, tiny little sausages, were spread on the hay behind her head, and her lips were parted. As happens sometimes, a moment settled and hovered, and remained for much more than a moment, and sound stopped, and movement stopped for much, much more than a moment. Then gradually time awakened again and moved sluggishly on. The horses stamped on the other side of the feeding racks, and the halter chains clanked. Outside, the men's voices became louder and clearer. It's kind of the opposite of our videos. In this case, we get our intense scene first, followed by our light scene. So Lenny just killed Curly's wife. He did the same things we've seen him do time and time again. He likes to touch soft things and says, "Hey, touch my hair is soft," and he does, and when she goes to pull away, he does what we've seen him do before, which he grabs a hold. And I mean, as we can expect, that makes her nervous, and she goes to pull away, and he holds on tighter, and then she starts screaming. He's like, "Don't do that, George will be in trouble." And the whole time, his biggest worry is that he can't tend the rabbits. There's no thought about what he might be doing to Curly's wife. And even after he kills her, breaks her neck, he thinks, "Oh no, George won't let me tend the rabbits. This is a bad thing." And he knows he has to go hide in the brush by the river. He tosses the puppy. He's like, "Oh, it's bad enough there's a dead girl here. I want him to see the dead puppy too." But again, he doesn't seem to understand the consequences of his actions. He's never been taught that it was bad. He's always been taught that he can't control it and that it's not his fault. And George always fixes it for him. That's what he expects George to do now, to fix it for him. So he takes off. And then we get this really quiet moment in the barn. And that's our first lesson. Very quiet in the barn. And the quiet of the afternoon was on the ranch. And sound stopped and movement stopped for much, much more than a moment. So Steinbeck slows down this moment to really let sink in for the reader the enormity of what just happened, how big of a deal this is. This also gives us time to think, what's going to happen next to Lenny, to George, to the ranch that they wanted to get? What's going to go? Where are we going to go from here? Because now it's murder. That's a big deal. So we kind of slow down. And now we're picking the scene back up again. So we're about halfway down page 93. From around the end of the last stall, old Candy's voice came. "Lenny," he called. "Oh, Lenny, you in here? I've been figuring some more. Tell you what we can do, Lenny." Old Candy appeared around the end of the last stall. "Oh, Lenny," he called again, and then he stopped and his body stiffened. He rubbed a smooth wrist on his white stubble whiskers. "I didn't know you was here," he said to Curly's wife. When she didn't answer, he stepped nearer. "You oughtn't to sleep out here," he said disapprovingly, and then he was beside her and, "Oh, Jesus Christ!" He looked about helplessly and rubbed his beard, and then he jumped up and went quickly out of the barn. But the barn was alive now. The horses stamped and snorted, and they chewed the straw of their bedding, and they clashed the chains of their halters. In a moment Candy came back, and George was with them. George said, "What was it you wanted to see me about?" Candy pointed at Curly's wife. George stared. "What's the matter with her?" he asked. He stepped closer, then he echoed Candy's words. "Oh, Jesus Christ!" He was down on his knees beside her. He put his hand over her heart, and finally, when he stood up slowly and stiffly, his face was hard and tight as wood, and his eyes were hard. Candy said, "What done it?" George looked coldly at him. "Ain't you got any idea?" he said. And Candy was silent. "I should have knew," George said hopelessly. "I guess maybe way back in my head I did." Candy asked, "What we gonna do now, George? What we gonna do now?" George was a long time in answering. "Guess we gotta tell the guys. I guess we gotta get him and lock him up. We can't let him get away. Why, the poor bastard'd starve." And he tried to reassure himself. Maybe they'll lock him up and be nice to him. But Candy said excitedly, "We ought to let him get away. You don't know that Curly. Curly gonna want him lynched. Curly'll get him killed." George watched Candy's lips. "Yeah," he said at last. "That's right. Curly will. And the other guys will." He looked back at Curly's wife. Now Candy spoke his greatest fear. "You and me can get that little place, can't we, George? You and me can go there and live nice, can't we, George? Can't we?" Before George answered, Candy dropped his head and looked down at the hay. He knew. George said softly, "I think I knowed from the very first. I think I knowed we'd never do her. He used to like to hear about it so much I got thinking maybe we would." "Then it's all off?" Candy asked sulkily. George didn't answer his question. George said, "I'll work my month and I'll take my $50 and I'll stay all night in some lousy cat house, or I'll sit in some pool room till everybody goes home. Then I'll come back and work another month and I'll have $50 more." Candy said, "He's such a nice fella. I didn't think he'd do nothing like this." George still stared at Curly's wife. "Lenny never done it in meanness," he said. "All the time he done bad things, but he never done one of 'em mean." He straightened up and looked back at Candy. "Now listen, we gotta tell the guys. They gotta bring him in, I guess. There ain't no way out. Maybe they won't hurt him," he said sharply. "I ain't gonna let him hurt Lenny. Now you listen, the guys might think I was in on it. I'm gonna go in the bunkhouse, and in a minute you come out and tell the guys about her, and I'll come along and make like I never seen her. Will you do that, so the guys won't think I was in on it?" Candy said, "Sure, George, I'll do that." "Okay, give me a couple minutes then, and you come running out and tell like you just found her. I'm going now." George turned and went quickly out of the barn. Okay, so the ranch isn't going to happen. George says, "I guess I always knew this wouldn't happen. I always knew something like this would happen with Lenny, but I got caught up in my dreams." But now he realizes that people might think he's in on it, so he's leaving, and he's going to give him a couple minutes to kind of get away, call for everybody else in, show them what happened, and then they got to figure out what to do about Lenny. Old Candy watched him go. He looked helplessly back at Curly's wife, and gradually his sorrow and his anger grew into words. "You goddamn tramp," he said viciously. "You done it, didn't you? I suppose you're glad. Everybody knowed you'd mess things up. You wasn't no good. You ain't no good now, you lousy tart." He sniveled and his voice shook. "I could have hoed in the garden and washed dishes for them guys." He paused and then went on in a sing-song, and he repeated the old words. "If there was a circus or a baseball game, he would have went to her. Just said to hell with work and went to her. Never asked nobody say so. And they'd have been a pig and chickens, and in the winter, the little flat stove and the rain coming, and us just setting there." His eyes blinded with tears, and he turned and went weakly out of the barn, and he rubbed his bristly whiskers with his wrist stump. Outside, the noise of the game stopped. There was a rise of voices in question, a drum of running feet, and the men burst into the barn. Slim and Carlson and young Whit and Curly and Crooks keeping back out of attention range. Candy came after them, and last of all came George. George had put on his blue denim coat and buttoned it, and his black hat was pulled down low over his eyes. The men raced around the last stall. Their eyes found Curly's wife in the gloom. They stopped and stood still and looked. Then Slim went quietly over to her, and he felt her wrist. One lean finger touched her cheek, and then his hand went under her slightly twisted neck, and his fingers explored her neck. When he stood up, the men crowded near, and the spell was broken. Curly came suddenly to life. "I know who done it," he cried. "That big son of a bitch done it. I know he done it, while everybody else was out there playing horseshoes." He worked himself into fury. "I'm gonna get him. I'm going for my shotgun. I'll kill the big son of a bitch myself. I'll shoot him in the guts. Come on, you guys." He ran furiously out of the barn. Carlson said, "I'll get my Luger," and he ran out too. Slim turned quietly to George. "I guess Lenny done it all right," he said. "Her neck's bust. Lenny could have done that." George didn't answer, but he nodded slowly. His hat was so far down on his forehead that his eyes were covered. Slim went on, "Maybe like that time in Weed you were telling me about?" Again, George nodded. Slim sighed. Well, I guess we gotta get to him. Where do you think he might have went? It seemed to take George some time to free his words. He would have went south, he said. We come from the north, so he would have went south. I guess we gotta get him, Slim repeated. George stepped close. Couldn't we maybe bring him in and they'll lock him up? He's nuts, Slim. He never done this to be mean. Slim nodded. We might, he said. If we could keep Curly in, we might. But Curly's gonna want to shoot him. Curly's still mad about his hand. And suppose they lock him up and strap him down and put him in a cage? That ain't no good, George. I know, said George, I know. Carlson came running in. The bastard stole my Luger, he shouted. It ain't in my bag. Curly followed him, and Curly carried a shotgun in his good hand. Curly was cold now. All right, you guys, he said. Crook's got a shotgun. You take it, Carlson. When you see him, don't give him no chance. Shoot for his guts. That'll double him over. Whit said excitedly, I ain't got a gun. Curly said, you go in Soledad and get a cop. Get Al Wiltz, he's deputy sheriff. Let's go now. He turned suspiciously on George. You coming with us, fella? Yeah, said George, I'll come. But listen, Curly, the poor bastard's nuts. Don't shoot him. He didn't know what he was doing. Don't shoot him, Curly cried. He got Carlson's Luger. Of course we'll shoot him. George said weakly, maybe Carlson lost his gun. I seen it this morning, said Carlson. No, it's been took. Slim stood looking down at Curly's wife. He said, Curly, maybe you better stay here with your wife. Curly's face reddened. I'm going, he said. I'm going to shoot the guts out of that big bastard myself. Even if I only got one hand, I'm going to get him. Slim turned to Candy. You stay here with her then, Candy. The rest of us better get going. They moved away. George stopped a moment beside Candy, and they both looked down at the dead girl until Curly called, You, George, you stick with us so we don't think you had nothing to do with this. George moved slowly after them, and his feet dragged heavily. And when they were gone, Candy squatted down in the hay and watched the face of Curly's wife. Poor bastard, he said softly. The sound of the men grew fainter. The barn was darkening gradually, and in their stalls the horses shifted their feet and rattled the halter chains. Old Candy lay down in the hay and covered his eyes with his arm. Okay, so this kind of goes into our second lesson, which was the climax of the story. And this moment where our main character changes is when George realizes that he says, I should have knew, I guess maybe way back in my head, I did. Things can never be the same. They cannot go back. This isn't something George can just fix for Lenny. And again, there's that loss of paradise. George is hopeless. He knows his dream is dead. He knows that Lenny went to go hide in the brush, and he says, we came from the north, so Lenny will run south, which is the opposite of what he's going to do. Lenny's going to go north where they came from because he's going to the brush by the river. So how George is intending to get there, we don't know because he's got to leave with Curly and everybody else, and how this is going to all play out. But Curly wants him dead. Curly plans to kill Lenny. And George suggests maybe, locking him up so that he can't hurt anybody anymore, but he knows that Lenny is not mean. Again, nobody taught Lenny how to be better, how to control his anger, how to control his strength, anything like that. So, and Lenny doesn't understand the consequences of what it is that he is doing. So we will finish up tomorrow and see how this all plays out. As far as in your book today, so try to give an example where the pace has slowed or sped up, and what purpose did that serve? And so then if you're stuck, think about a major event in your novel. What happened just before that event took place? And see if that has any sort of different pace. And then what was the point in your book where you or the main character knew nothing would ever be the same, and discuss what theme that might connect to. So those are your couple ideas as to what you should be looking for in your book. I'll see you for our last day of Mice and Men tomorrow.